Greetings. This is Bradford, Donald, Keller, Townsend, and this is a forward research memoir, a first-person account of the 1986 United States Navy Mutiny, and testimony to what life was like on a super aircraft carrier during the mutiny of 1986. What was life like on a carrier in 1986? It's like a lot of things in life. I tell people that you have to experience it. If you don't have any children and you haven't been with your wife as she's gone through a pregnancy from conception to being sick and suffering during the pregnancy, and being there in the delivering room, encouraging her and holding her hand and rubbing her back while she's delivering the child, and then holding a newborn child in your hands after the nurses have cleaned off the child, or you have. You just don't know the joy of fatherhood. If you haven't built your own home or created a work of art with a lot of work, energy, labor, and passion, you just can't relate. Giving a performance on a theater stage and watching it is different than actually being a performer and trying to give a performance, singing, dancing, delivering your lines and emotions, interacting with the other actors on the stage. Being in combat, you can't really, no matter how many movies you watch or books you read, you don't get the feeling of being there, the smell of it, the concussion of the explosions, the screams of your comrades who are injured, and what that does to you, hearing their screams and breaking down because they're injured. So this is an account of I'm a Blue Nose, which means I've been across the Arctic Circle in a ship and done air operations above the Arctic Circle, and I've crossed, I'm a shellback, I've crossed the equator multiple times and circumnavigated the globe from north to south and from east to west. I've sailed all around the world, and plus additional travels on my own as a civilian. In 1986, my story, I was conflicted. As a cadet and midshipman at the Virginia Military Institute, 60 Minutes television program came to the post. That's what we call a college campus on a military academy, and they interviewed me as I was the spokesman for the Virginia Military Institute, the cadet spokesman. And they asked me about the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I gave the standard answer that it saved lives. And I still think that's true, a correct response. That although it was horrific, if we had invaded with conventional land forces, more Japanese would have died and more Americans would have died, probably 3 to 5 times at least as many. That did bring a closer end to the war. And being, there with the cameras on me, and they have the lighting and the shading and a whole staff of people, half a dozen people there with the correspondent, bringing in a van full of gear and setting it up and interviewing you in your dress uniform as a third classman or sophomore at a military academy. And I was all gung-ho, and had been a corporal drill instructor and everything of the incoming freshmen that year, and was a member of the Ranger platoon there, where we rappelled out of helicopters and shot machine guns and threw live grenades and all that as part of our training. And we're trained by U.S. Army Special Forces and Army Ranger officers completely. And we had them on staff there at the Institute. They're active duty Special Forces officers who trained us. And that was like our major extracurricular activity, like being on the basketball team or wrestling team or something, except we were training to be commando officers. It really hit me to the core when I heard that come out of my mouth, as my uncle was the logistics chief officer of the Manhattan Project and had other members of my family at Lawrence Livermore nuclear laboratories and such. Life aboard a supercarrier in 1985, 1986 was varied very much depending on what your duties and job assignments were on the ship. I had left the Virginia Military Institute for more than one reason, and had taken a break for a few weeks and then enlisted into the Navy and then went to boot camp and went to machinist mate training, which is how to operate and maintain machinery on ships and to work in the engine room. They have steam turbines that turn the propeller shaft. And you're also in charge of air conditioning, making the potable water, which is boiling and distilling water, and the winches, all types of machinery on the ship. That's what you do as a machinist mate. It's kind of an obvious term. And I served on the ship in 3 different areas. In the one main machinery room, which is gigantic, about 3-4 stories tall, space. You almost have to go in there to see it, to see how large it is. And it's usually extremely hot as steam leaks from giant steam pipes, and the gigantic boiler radiates heat, and some of it's not even insulated. And then you have a control room that's air conditioned, and it has vents that are more than a meter square that blast with heavy fans. They'll blow your hat right off when you walk by the fans to keep that control room cool. And then I was in an auxiliary machinery room that distilled water and generated the ship's electricity. And I served on the flight deck, operating the catapults, arresting gear, and making sure the air conditioning units on that level of the ship that were going, which were vital for the command and control, because the computers need to be maintain a constant temperature, or they overheat or freeze up. So the mutiny. We had been on a North Atlantic NATO to counter Soviet Navy operations in the Arctic, and they had violated the territorial waters of a NATO ally, Norway. So we had to go up there. They told us it was the largest fleet of ships since the Second World War. And I was part of that huge fleet that went up there as a show of force, and we landed people on land who Marines and Navy SEALs and such that tried to run the Soviet forces, off of the territory of our allies, and Russian submarines hid in the fjords of Norway, and it was a cat and mouse game. Being, as I was a fireman at that time my job was working on the flight deck, and I slept on an I-beam underneath the flight deck. So I was like 1 meter below where the planes were landing and taking off, only a few meters inside the ship. And usually the door would open and close as people come in and out, and the cold air would whoosh in and whoosh out while I was sleeping on this I-beam underneath the flight deck, because I had to be there at any moment to make a repair, because it's life and death with the catapults and the arresting gear, or with the air conditioners as well. So it was a very arduous deployment. There's no days off when you're at sea. You're on call 24 hours a day and usually work at least a 16-hour work day doing maintenance or launching, recovering aircraft, distilling water, generating electricity. The generators, the evaporator, distilling machines, they all have to be checked at least every 10-15 minutes, and minor adjustments are constantly required. And every 15 minutes a report in writing signed off has to be taken to the command and control of engineering, and the chief engineer, a commander, or just like a lieutenant colonel in the Army Marines, is there, and you have to, and then you get court-martialed for lying or not getting your reports in on time. They call it captain's mast in the Navy. So it was a very arduous and difficult deployment, and upon return from this deployment, basically our ship, the ships of the United States Navy, and of course we don't know as it was going on how large it was, but I know that it included at least 2 aircraft carriers and most of the surface ships on the eastern coast of the United States. The sailors refused to go to sea. Some of them didn't report to duty, and some reported to duty and did sit-down strikes where they only did the minimum amount of work. So the response, there was, at that time, Nancy Reagan, who was the First Lady, and President Ronald Reagan was President of the United States, had implemented drug screening urinalysis tests. And nearly all the officers on my aircraft carrier, that not so much in the air wings, and they're not really crew, the air wings are not crew members of the ship, but the actual crew of the ship that's there all the time. Most of the officers were failed their drug screenings, and a large portion of the non-commissioned officers, the Navy calls them chief petty officers, and petty officers failed their tests. I was one of the few people in engineering who did not fail their drug tests. And for all the, I think everyone who was a second mate and above in rank, chief petty officers and commission officers were automatically given discharges from the Navy. So the entire, in an aircraft carrier, has thousands of permanent crew members. So we had, I would say, the majority, more than half, and then they didn't tell us, this. And as a fireman, I don't have statistics, but large amounts. It seems like all of my engineering officers tested positive in my chain of command, and the admiral who was the skipper of the ship, he was like a 2-star admiral, he failed. So everybody in my whole entire chain of command up through engineering and into the ship's chain of command, most all of them failed their drug tests and were discharged, including most of my non-commissioned officer leadership was all discharged for drug use or theft. We had a ring of thieves that would steal from the Navy and go out and steal when we were in port, whether it was in the United States, in our home port, or overseas. And they finally caught them, and there were several petty officers and chiefs in my chain of command that were thieving from the Navy in substantial numbers and going out, as a gang and stealing when we were overseas or in port in the U.S. So that the Naval Investigative Service brought down that ring of thieves at the same time. So the engineering department, some of them had not failed their urinalysis tests, but they were caught as thieves. So basically the whole leadership of the engineering division was taken down, and I was one of the few sailors left standing that was qualified to stand watches on the ship. And what this meant was I had to try to do the work of all these people who were gone. And I did the work of a commander at some times, or a colonel in the Army in charge of hundreds of men, because they brought in new people, but it takes time to get qualified in the Navy. You have to take written tests, you have to draw diagrams, you have to do practical tests and get certified, like to be a firefighter, to operate machinery. They don't just throw you at it. You have to prove you can do the job, because it's life and death. And then once you're qualified and signed off by 3 or 4 different people up the chain of command, you're allowed to stand that watch or do that maintenance task. And I was one of the few people that had a lot, and I'd been a Boy Scout and made it all the way up to Eagle Scout, and I didn't do the final project, but I got more than enough badges to be an Eagle Scout, and was kind of used to getting qualifications and badges type thing, and was somewhat ambitious in the Navy, so I got qualified on everything I possibly could. But then that kind of hit me hard when all these people were gone, and I had to have chiefs and ensigns and lieutenants and everybody following me around, and I had to qualify them as only an E3 fireman, first class, because I was the only one remaining a lot of times that was qualified to do many of the jobs. So as a young man, I had a huge amount of responsibility and was the chief fireman on the ship. And we had fires about twice a week, and I was responsible. And once the fire was called out, over the speaker system, until all the reflash watches, because a fire can restart on its own from the latent heat there, I had to stay and supervise it until I would fall asleep standing up from exhaustion. But until the fire was fully throughout the whole chain of command, like the skipper would come down and finally tell me I could. So I was usually the last firefighter to leave the first one on the scene, and the last one of the first few on the scene to actually fight the fire or lead the firefighting efforts, and then the last one to leave after the cleanup and everything had been done, or until I collapsed from exhaustion. So it was a very rigorous duty. During the mutiny, so the mutiny happened after everybody had failed their drug tests in this thieving ring, and they brought in thousands of United States Marines, which are part of the Navy Department, and there were Marines everywhere. You couldn't go anywhere without literally bumping into them, and they would stand with their, back then we called them M16 carbine assault rifles. Those are the little submachine gun type rifles that fire the little bullets. And then they had 12 gauge shotguns, a lot of them, which they thought were better at close quarters. Pump action shotguns were very popular with the Marines, and they were just everywhere, all over the base and on all the ships. And when we would go out to sea, they would lock us in with 5-6 pound giant locks that the Marines had keys to, and then our Marines with flak jackets and helmets and shotguns and submachine guns would stand there guarding the whole hallway. They not just the door to get down to the engine rooms, there'd be two, but like every few meters there would be two Marines, two Marines, two Marines. Because if something happened, like when we were patrolling in the Persian Gulf, if we hit a mine from Iran and it flooded the engine rooms, they didn't want our comrades in the engineering division to come and open the watertight doors. So the Marines had orders to shoot to kill if anybody tried to save us if we hit a mine or the engine room had a major malfunction and we were dying down there. To save the rest of the ship or to keep it operational, the Marines were, once we were locked in down there, we had to stay down there. And you weren't allowed to eat or bring any snacks or food down there. You were allowed to smoke and drink coffee, and then you had to go to the bathroom in the bilges and squat down or pee into the bilges. So, it was a very arduous, and it was extremely hot. It could be, so humid you couldn't really see very far past your hand if you extended it out, because steam was and moisture was everywhere, and it would be over 115 degrees Fahrenheit many times, and you'd just be covered with hives and sweating profusely. And because we were so undermanned, we had only one meal a day. Sometimes you had to wait an hour and a half in the chow line, and then you would get this metal tray of food, and then you would stand with the tray until the shore patrol, which is Navy police, they had a timer, like a stopwatch is literally, and they would only give you like 5 minutes to eat, but you had to wait for your turn. So you'd wait for the previous 100 men. Back then it was all men. They had a few women on the ship, but I hardly ever saw them in engineering. And they would get up and leave, and then we would get to sit down for 5 minutes and eat as fast as we could and try to eat our one portion of food. And then the shore patrol would tell us to get up and leave and go back on duty. And then the next group would get to sit down. They'd have to stand there with their trays for maybe 3 minutes until it was their turn, and then they'd sit down for 5. That's what it took to get 7,000 men and a few dozen women fed every day. So life aboard ship, it was dangerous. Being a fireman, one of the jobs I would usually get called to is when there were suicides. I would say we had at least a suicide every week on the ship. We had people jump overboard because life was so hard on the ship. People would have their sweetheart or wife would cheat on them and send them a letter informing them, and then they would want to commit suicide. And because they never gave you any break or rest, and just worked you till you literally collapsed, people, would commit suicide, and people also went insane and just would freak out and start punching people and talking gibberish and running into walls and doing all kinds of stuff. So when they talk about the Cold War, not being a war, I can tell you that people did suffer, and it was pretty dang hardcore being on the flight deck in the Arctic, because it would be freezing, below 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius, and then you'd have that cold being out there on the flight deck, because I operated the catapult, which is a giant piston that shoots the plane. It gives full thrust and then to its engines, and then the catapult gives it an extra oomph to get up into the air, and then the aircraft carrier turns into the wind and might be going 40 knots. And with all that, that's what gets the big air. And these aircraft are huge. The tires are some of these aircraft were taller than me, and I'm 6'3". So these are great big aircraft, and they were being launched. And then once they were launched, the ones that had jet engines, like the F-14 Tomcats, then there would be almost thunder as that hot air is gone, and then the vacuum is filled with cold air, or the hot air dissipates, I guess, thermodynamically, because everything always goes from hot to cold. But as that hot air gets sucked out into the lower cold area around it, um, that is a feeling of being scorched to being cold that you have to experience, and then to have that happen time and again every day, 100 times in a day, and then the huge roar, you're wearing double hearing protection, earplugs in your ears, and the Mickey Mouse ears, and it's hard to know how to dress because it could be really, really cold or scorching hot. So these horrific living conditions with poor leadership, abusive leadership sometimes, and we were ignored by the public, and they weren't told of our hardships, and we didn't get much respect. Import in the United States, a lot of places didn't want you to come and eat at their restaurants or drink at their pubs and that kind of thing. There literally were signs, no sailors allowed, or if you went into a bar in a major port town, sometimes the bartenders, would kind of sneer at you and even ask you to leave and go to a different bar. So, we weren't appreciated by the American public. That's where I started going to country western bars to hang out, because they were the friendly toward military personnel. But it was still close enough after the Vietnam era that the military was still quite unpopular. So it was a very challenging time to be serving in the military, and I thought the facts of this need to be told from a historical standpoint. This is a memoir, and memoirs, a first account memoir is a pretty good source. It's not as good as if I'd have kept a diary. I wish I'd have kept a detailed diary, but as you can tell, it was so tough that I would probably just be too tired when I did get a little time off to rest, to take a quick shower and jump onto my I-beam or onto my little bunk to sit and write for 5-10 minutes. But this is what I recall. And the Marines have a saying, "Semper Fidelis," always faithful. And cheers to all my comrades, the United States Navy and of the U.S. Armed Forces, and especially those who are underappreciated. Thank you, and have a wonderful day. This has been a Forward Research Report. Farewell and goodbye. Leve wohl und auf Wiedersehen. Adieu et au revoir.